Mr. Speaker, honorable members are advised that on Thursday, November 15, 2018, the Ministry of Finance successfully accessed the international capital markets and raised $620 million in long 10-year bonds. Therefore, in accordance with Section 2.3 of the Government Loans Act, 1978, I am pleased to rise this morning to inform this Honorable House of the execution of this borrowing transaction pursuant to the requirements of the Act. Mr. Speaker, I can now report on the successful capital markets transaction, which raised $620 million in 10-year bonds at an all-in yield of just 4.75% by the government of Bermuda. The transaction represents the lowest ever bond spread to date achieved by the government of Bermuda in the public bond markets. What do I mean by the term bond spread? The bond spread is the difference between the yield on Bermuda's bonds as compared to the yield on the comparable referenced U.S. Treasury 10-year bond. This spread is a measure of what investors use to assess the level of risk inherent in a bond issuance, and it basically is an indication of whether we obtained a good deal or not. The smaller the spread, the better the deal. Mr. Speaker, here is a brief overview of the process that led to this successful transaction. As announced on Wednesday, November 7, 2018, the Bermuda government conducted a series of meetings and calls with fixed-income investors in Europe and the United States to provide an update on economic and fiscal developments in the country since the PLP came into office. These meetings were also a part of the government's process of evaluating market conditions and potential funding opportunities to address its borrowing requirements, as laid out in a national budget statement for fiscal years 2018 and 2019. At the same time, it was also announced that concurrently, Bermuda would offer to repurchase for cash 2 series of our outstanding U.S. dollar bonds. Mr. Speaker, after hearing of the government's plans to grow our economy and reduce our deficit, feedback from prospective investors was very constructive and supportive of the proposed transaction. Accordingly, the subsequent transaction attracted healthy demand from some of the world's top investors. Given the receptive context for new U.S. dollar debt issuance and the favorable prevailing base rates, the government took the opportunity to not only finance the remaining fiscal 2018-2019 budget deficit, but also to refinance a $135 million loan facility with a local financial institution that is scheduled to mature in 2019 and engage concurrently with the new issue a targeted liability management transaction strategically aimed at repurchasing all of our 5.603 coupon bonds maturing in 2020 and reducing up to $200 million of our 4.854% coupon bonds maturing in 2024. Mr. Speaker, it is important to note that although the government issued a total of $620 million in new bonds, the majority of the proceeds were used to refinance existing indebtedness and the remainder to fund the anticipated deficit for the fiscal year 2018-2019. As mentioned previously, the government of Bermuda conducted an effective and well-timed roadshow that included calls and in-person meetings with almost 40 global accounts during a 4-day marketing effort and roadshow in the major hubs in Europe and the United States. These accounts would eventually represent approximately 63% of the final allocated book. Mr. Speaker, following the roadshow, on Thursday, November 15, 2018, the transaction was announced, and the transaction immediately attracted healthy demand and the attention of the world's top institutional investors, allowing the interest rate on the notes to be reduced, thereby reducing that bond spread that I referenced earlier. The bond spread and a very large order book confirm that the market has a very favorable view of the new government's economic and fiscal plans. The success of this transaction is an independent, objective validation of these plans. Mr. Speaker, highlights of the transaction include, on Thursday, November 15, 2018, the Ministry of Finance successfully accessed the international capital markets, placing via intraday execution a $620 million long 10-year bond offering due February 2029. This resulted in a low coupon of 4.75%. The weighted average cost of borrowing has been reduced from this transaction. Interest savings of approximately $1 million per year have been achieved. Market conditions continue to favor Bermuda. Pricing was 20 basis points inside the last 10-year issuance by the government of Bermuda in October of 2016. That was Treasuries plus 175 versus Treasuries plus 195, which was achieved in 2016. The reductions achieved even with the U.S. Treasury 10-year rate widening 130 basis points since October of 2016. That'll be 1.77% then versus 3.09% last week, Thursday. We removed $200 million from the largest maturity tower, taking down the 2024s from $750 million to $550 million, smoothing out the entire debt maturity profile. Refinancing of the shorter-term maturities, Bermuda now has no major bonds due until 2023 instead of 2020, significantly improving our liquidity profile. There was a true show of support for the Bermuda credit from top global accounts. The order book showed a healthy oversubscription of 3.2 times, comprised of some of the world's top high-quality asset managers, fund managers, insurance companies, and pension funds, underpinned by U.S. accounts and well supported by the UK and continental Europe accounts. The higher total order book than in 2016, I think we achieved $1.5 billion in 2016 versus $2 billion last week. A notable 25 basis points tightening from initial price talk of Treasuries plus 200 to directly launching the first trade at Treasuries plus 175 basis points. A well-timed execution with the U.S. Treasury bond reference yield dipping to its lowest point in a month to 3.09% after trading to an average of 3.15% during the past 4 weeks and trading as high as 3.24% just 1 week back. Mr. Speaker, this landmark transaction marked the government of Bermuda's return to the international capital markets since 2016, successfully reducing its average cost of debt, as well as extending the life of its debt maturity profile. Mr. Speaker, the government's team that was involved in the roadshow was the Honorable Premier David Burt, myself, and Anthony Mandos, the Financial Secretary. The government team was also supported by key senior officials in the Ministry of Finance and the Attorney General's chambers. The Finance Ministry wishes to thank HSBC Bank of Bermuda, HSBC Securities USA, Inc., and Citigroup Global Markets, Inc., joint book runners of the deal. Milbank Tweed, the government's U.S. counsel, and Simpson Thatcher, HSBC USA and Citibank's attorneys, for their roles as strategic partners in helping to shape a very positive outcome for the government of Bermuda in this recent issue in the global markets. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.